The wind didn't just blow through the high Colorado passes, it screamed, tearing across the frozen ridges like a wild animal hunting for prey. It was a sound that would send a shiver down the spine of any city dweller, a warning to stay away. But Samuel McBride just lowered his head and pushed forward. The snow was already knee-deep and rising, clinging to his heavy buffalo coat. But Sam didn't slow down. A string of fresh rabbits bounced against his belt with every heavy step. At 40 years old, with a dozen brutal winters etched into his weathered face, he knew these mountains intimately better, in fact, than he knew any living soul. For Sam, the harshness of the high country was preferable to civilization. He had learned a long time ago to trust the biting cold more than the warmth of a handshake. The mountains might kill you if you were careless, sure, but at least they were honest about it. They never lied to your face while stabbing you in the back. By the time the silhouette of his cabin came into view, the world around him was vanishing into a wall of white. Thick, heavy flakes fell from a slate-gray sky, instantly filling the boot prints he left behind. His cabin wasn't a palace, just a sturdy timber structure tucked tight against a granite wall for shelter, with smoke curling bravely from the stone chimney he'd stacked with his own bleeding hands. It was small, rough, and isolated, but it was his. It was the one place on earth safe from the memories of the world he'd walked away from. Once, inside, the roar of the wind dulled to a low moan. Sam hung his game by the door, threw a fresh log on the fire, and poured a cup of coffee that was black as pitch and bitter enough to wake the dead. He looked around the single room. It hadn't changed in years. There was the rope bed in the corner, a table he'd hewn from pine, to empty chairs, and shelves stacked with the jars of preserves that would keep him alive until spring. Above the stone hearth hung his father's old Winchester rifle, gleaming in the firelight. Every object in that room told a story of survival and solitude. The gold fields had claimed his brother's life, sickness had taken his parents, and the last soft, hopeful part of Samuel McBride had died when Sarah, the woman he'd planned to build a life with, chose the security of a banker's son over the uncertainty of a poor farmer. After that, Sam decided he was done with people. The mountains made no promises they couldn't keep. They asked for nothing, and they gave nothing back that you didn't fight for. That was a deal he could understand. He was sitting at the table, halfway through the ritual of cleaning his rifle, when a sound shattered the peace. It was a knock, weak, uneven, barely audible over the wind. Sam froze, his hand tightening on the rag. No one came up this high in December, not unless they were lost, desperate, or looking for trouble. He held his breath. Another knock. Then, a voice. "Please, someone. Please help us." It was a woman's voice. It sounded thin, shaking violently with cold and terrified. Sam stood up slowly, his hand drifting instinctively to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He moved toward the door with the silent, stalking grace of a predator. Years alone had made him wary. Outlaws weren't above using tricks to get a door open. But that voice, it sounded raw, real. "Who's there?" Sam barked, his voice rough from disuse. Two voices answered in unison this time. One young, one older, both laced with panic. "Please, sir, we're freezing. We'll die out here." Sam hesitated. Every survival instinct he had honed over the last decade screamed at him to keep that door bolted, to keep the world and its problems outside. But there was something in that plea that cut through his defenses. He recognized the tone. It was fear. It was loss. It was the sound of someone at the end of their rope. He lifted the heavy wooden bar and cracked the door open, his pistol ready. The sight that greeted him made him blink. Two women stood on his doorstep, looking more like snow, sculptures than people. The younger one, maybe 30 years old, had dark hair plastered to her face in freezing wet strands. She was practically holding up the older woman, who looked like she was fading fast. Their clothes were pitifully thin for this weather, their hands turned a bruised blue, and their boots were falling to pieces. They clutched to small, sad bundles. To their chests everything they owned in the world. "Please," the younger woman begged, her teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. "We've followed the smoke. We've been walking since yesterday. She can't go any farther." As if on cue, the older woman's eyes rolled back. Her knees gave way, and she began to crumple into the snow. Sam didn't think. He didn't weigh the pros and cons. He just reacted. Death was standing on his porch, and he wasn't about to let it in. Get inside, he commanded, throwing the door wide open. Quick! The younger woman let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp as she hauled her companion over the threshold. Sam didn't waste a second. He slammed the heavy timber door shut and dropped the locking bar into place, instantly cutting off the howling white fury outside. The silence that followed was sudden and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ragged, shallow breathing of the two women. They stood there, shivering so violently that their teeth clicked together. Their skin was the color of old parchment, pale and stiff. Get to the hearth, Sam ordered, his voice sharp but not unkind. He was already moving, stripping the heavy wool blankets from his own bed. Don't just stand there. Get those wet things off before the frost takes your fingers. He turned to the stove to heat a kettle of water, keeping his back turned to give them a scrap of dignity. His ears, however, remained trained on them, a habit from years of living, where a strange sound could mean a mountain lion or a drifter. With a knife, he heard the wet slap of frozen fabric hitting the floor, the sharp intakes of breath as the fire's heat began to sting their numb skin. It was the sound of survival, painful and raw. After a few minutes, when the rustling stopped, Sam poured 2 tin cups of steaming coffee and turned around. They were huddled together on the floor by the fire, wrapped in his gray wool blankets like cocoons. He handed them the cups. The younger woman's hands shook so bad she had to use both of them to hold the tin. "Thank you," she whispered, the steam rising into her face. She took a sip and closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth. Then she looked up at him. "My name is Elizabeth Harper, and this is Martha Coleman." Sam nodded once, his face unreadable. "We're widows, sir," Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining a little more strength. "We were trying to make it to Denver, but the weather turned so fast." Sam glanced at the frosted window pane. "You're lucky you found this cabin," he said, his tone grim. "A storm like this doesn't just freeze you, it buries you. By morning, the whole valley will be gone under snow." Elizabeth swallowed hard, looking down at her cup. "We didn't have much choice. We were driven out of Silver Creek." Sam raised an eyebrow. Silver Creek was a rough mining town, the kind of place that chewed people up and spat them out. "Driven out? Folks said we were." "Bad luck," she admitted, her voice trembling with a mix of cold and shame. "Martha's husband was killed in a card game gone wrong. Mine died when a shaft collapsed at the Darkley mine. After that, the town turned on us. They blamed us for every misfortune that hit the camp: dry wells, sickness, bad yields." Sam felt his jaw tighten. He knew exactly what fear and superstition could do to small, desperate communities. People looked for scapegoats when life got hard, and to lone women were easy targets. "We don't have any money to pay you," Elizabeth added quickly, sensing his silence. "But we can work, we can cook, sew, clean, anything you need. We aren't here to cause trouble." Sam looked at them, the terrified women huddling by his fire, offering to scrub his floors just to keep from freezing to death. He grabbed another blanket from the shelf and handed it to Martha, trying to ignore the way their desperation tugged at the part of him he thought was long dead. "You stay until the storm breaks," he said, his voice gruff to hide the softness underneath. "I don't want your money, and I don't need a maid." Martha reached out then, her hand trembling but radiating a surprising amount of warmth as she touched his forearm. "You're a good man, Mr. McBride," she said softly. He blinked. He hadn't told them his name. "Samuel," he corrected automatically. "Samuel McBride." Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes wide and full of a gratitude that made him uncomfortable. It was to intimate, to raw. "Thank you, Mr. McBride," she whispered. "You saved our lives tonight." Sam pulled his arm away and turned back to his rifle on the table. He didn't want their thanks. He didn't want a connection. He wanted this cabin to remain exactly what it had always been, a fortress of solitude. Safe, quiet, empty. But as the two widows sat there, bathed in the orange glow of his fire, filling the room with their presence, Sam felt a heavy realization settle in his chest. The silence he had carefully cultivated for 12 years was gone. His life wouldn't be empty tonight, and looking at the way the firelight caught Elizabeth's eyes, he had a sinking feeling that his solitude was under siege in a way the storm outside could never match. Morning arrived slowly, dragging a pale, reluctant light through the frosted window panes as if the sun itself wasn't sure it belonged in such a frozen world. Samuel McBride sat stiffly in his wooden chair by the dying embers of the fire, his arms crossed tight over his chest. He'd spent the night pretending to sleep, eyes half open, watching the shadows. He had insisted the women take his bed while he took the watch, telling himself it was just a precaution against the unknown. But deep down, Sam knew the truth. It wasn't about safety. It was about the fact that something fundamental had shifted the moment he let them in, and he wasn't sure how to rest in a house that no longer felt entirely like his own. Elizabeth stirred first. She stepped out from behind the heavy wool blanket Sam had strung up to give them some privacy. She looked different in the gray morning light. The panic of the night before had been scrubbed away. Her dark hair was neatly braided now, and though her face was still drawn with worry, there was color in her cheeks. She looked stronger. "Mr. McBride," she said softly, her voice startling him in the quiet. "You shouldn't have given us the bed. You look exhausted." Sam stretched, his neck cracking audibly. He rolled his shoulders, trying to work out the knots. "I've slept in worse places than a chair, ma'am. Don't worry about me. But you shouldn't have to," Elizabeth insisted, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. Before Sam could brush her off, Martha emerged. She moved slowly, favoring her legs, but she held herself upright with a dignity that hadn't been there when she was freezing to death. Her gray eyes fixed on Sam with a calm, penetrating gaze, the kind of look a school teacher gives a student who's hiding something. "Mr. McBride," Martha said, easing herself into the other chair with a soft groan. "Elizabeth told me what you said last night." Sam tensed up immediately. "Said about what?" "About not having a wife," she replied gently. "About living alone." Sam's jaw set hard. "That's my business, isn't it?" "Of course it is," Martha agreed, her tone soothing rather than confrontational. "I just want you to know that loss leaves a mark on everyone, Samuel. It shapes us. You aren't the only one in this room carrying ghosts." The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with unspoken histories. Elizabeth broke the tension by moving to the stove. She used the last of their own meager supplies to whip up a breakfast of fried mush. It wasn't much, but she plated it with care. "We'll help you make your supplies last," she promised as she set a tin plate in front of him. "We won't be a burden." "On your larder." Sam stared at the food. He didn't answer because he didn't know how. For 12 years, every meal had been eaten in silence. Just one plate, one fork, one man. Now, there were 3 plates steaming on the rough-hewn table. There were 3 voices bouncing off the log walls. 3 lives suddenly knotted together by a blizzard. He wasn't sure he hated it, and that terrified him more than the storm. "I need to check the livestock," he muttered abruptly, standing up and grabbing his heavy coat. He needed air. Outside, the world had been erased. The snow was piled high against the cabin walls, drifting up to the windowsills. The trees were bowed low under the weight of the ice, and the cold was a physical weight that pressed against his lungs. But compared to the confusing warmth inside the cabin, this cold was simple. It was predictable. It was safe. He took his time checking the shed, ensuring the mule and the few chickens were still alive, delaying his return as long as he could. But eventually the cold drove him back. When he pushed the door open, he stopped dead in his tracks. The cabin was different. In the hour he'd been gone, the floor had been swept clean of debris. The clutter on his shelves had been straightened. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something domestic. Elizabeth was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of melting snow for water, while Martha sat by the window, a needle in her hand, mending a tear in one of his old flannel shirts. They froze when he entered, sensing his hesitation. "We aren't trying to take over, Mr. McBride," Elizabeth said quickly, seeing the look on his face. We wanted to make ourselves useful." Sam looked at the mended shirt, then at the clean floor. He didn't know what to say to these women, who were trying to pay for their survival with housekeeping. So, he said nothing at all. He just hung up his coat and walked to the fire, wondering how his fortress of solitude had crumbled so fast. As the day bled into night, the storm outside seemed to find a second wind, battering the cabin with renewed fury. Inside, they were finishing a simple supper of beans and cornbread when Elizabeth suddenly gasped, her spoon clattering onto the table. "Look," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger toward the frosted window pane. Sam turned slowly. Through the swirling white and the thick glass, two pairs of eyes reflected the firelight, glowing green orbs staring out of the darkness. Then, more shapes materialized behind them. Wolves, gaunt, hungry shadows prowling the perimeter of the light. Martha shrank back in her chair, clutching her shawl tight. "They're watching us. They're starving," Elizabeth whispered, her voice tight with primal fear. "What if they try to break in?" Sam didn't flinch. He didn't even stand up immediately. He just took another bite of his cornbread, chewing slowly. "They won't come in," he said, his voice level and calm. "They know the rules of this place. Animals only attack when men forget to respect the mountain. As long as we stay smart, they'll keep their distance." Despite his words, he stood up and took the Winchester down from the wall. He pulled his chair closer to the window, sitting with the rifle across his lap, not aggressively, but with a quiet readiness that filled the room. Elizabeth and Martha instinctively moved their chairs closer to the fire and closer to him, drawn by the danger outside and the unshakable stability of the man inside. The wolves eventually faded back into the tree line, but their presence had changed the air in the room. The cabin felt smaller now, tighter. The space between the three of them was charged with an unspoken bond they could no longer ignore. Elizabeth watched him from the fireside, the orange light dancing in her eyes. "Don't you ever get lonely, Samuel?" she asked. It was a bold question, soft but piercing. Sam kept his gaze on the fire, refusing to look at her. "Lonely is just wanting what you can't have," he answered gruffly. "You stop wanting, and it stops hurting." Martha shook her head slowly, her voice holding the weight of experience. "That isn't how loneliness works, Mr. McBride. That's just how you bury it. And buried things have a way of digging themselves out." Sam didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was answer enough. They all knew she was right. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. The storm refused to break, trapping them in a world that ended at the cabin walls. And in that forced confinement, they began to learn the map of each other's lives. Elizabeth took over the cooking, turning meager rations into actual meals. Martha filled the silence with stories of her teaching days. Sam checked his traps, chopped wood, and found himself fixing small things around the cabin, a loose hinge, a wobbly chair leg that he had ignored for years. It felt like life, real, messy, shared life, and Sam was terrified to find that he didn't hate it. On the fourth morning, the tension finally snapped. Sam was returning from the shed with a bucket of snowmelt when he found Elizabeth struggling to lift the heavy cast-iron water kettle. He reached out to help, and his hand brushed over hers. The contact was electric. Elizabeth jerked her hand back as if she'd been burned, her eyes wide. Sam stepped back just as fast, turning away to hang his coat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pretended nothing had happened, but something had. Martha, watching from her corner with a small smile, murmured, "You to remind me of children afraid to admit the playground isn't as scary as you thought." Sam grunted something unintelligible and found a sudden interest in inspecting the roof beams. That night, as the wind howled a low, mournful note, Elizabeth reached into her bundle and pulled out a slender wooden flute. "May I?" she asked shyly. "Please," Martha encouraged. Sam just nodded, staring into the flames. She lifted the instrument to her lips and began to play. It started as a breath, then swelled into a melody, soft, trembling, and achingly sweet. The notes floated through the rough cabin, carrying memories of green valleys and warmer days. It was a song of loss, but also of hope. Martha wiped a tear from her cheek. Sam sat as still as a stone statue, but inside, the ice around his heart was cracking. The music reached places he had boarded up 12 years ago, when the last note faded The silence was deafening. "Play another," Sam said, his voice hoarse. He spoke before he could stop himself. Elizabeth looked up, surprised, and then a genuine smile broke across her face, warm and alive. She began a faster, lighter tune. Martha started humming along, and without even realizing it, Sam's boot began to tap the floorboards. Outside, the winter raged on, but inside Samuel McBride, the thaw had finally begun. The storm finally broke on the 7th morning. It left behind a world transformed, a landscape sculpted in blinding white, where the drifts were so deep they swallowed the fence posts and crept halfway up the cabin windows. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, innocent and bright, as if the violence of the last week had never happened. Sam opened the heavy timber door, blinking against the glare. The air was crisp and still. For a moment, it seemed like the peace he had always cherished had returned. But the mountains had a way of playing tricks on you. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. He felt it before he saw it. A vibration in the ground. Then came the sound, the crunch of hooves breaking through crusty snow, the snort of a horse, the murmur of men's voices. Inside the cabin, the domestic warmth instantly evaporated. Elizabeth and Martha froze, their eyes locking onto Sam's back. They knew, stay inside. Sam ordered, his voice low and hard, "Do not show your faces." He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him until it latched with a heavy click. He held his Winchester loosely in one hand, the barrel pointed at the ground, but his finger was resting on the trigger guard. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses struggling through the deep powder. Sam recognized the lead rider immediately, and his stomach turned. It was Deputy Carlson. The man wore a badge pinned to his coat, but it looked crooked, like a costume on a man who didn't understand what it stood for. Flanking him were 2 rough-looking men from Silver Creek, including Jake Morrison, a man known more for his bar fights than his civic duty. They weren't here for a neighborly visit. "Samuel McBride," Carlson shouted, pulling his horse up a few yards from the porch. Steam rose from the animal's flanks. "We know you're in there." Sam didn't move. He stood like a part of the cabin, rooted and immovable. "I'm right here." "Carlson, no need to shout," the deputy sneered, leaning forward in his saddle. "We're looking for 2 women, fugitives. They stole dry goods and money from Hartley's store back in town. We tracked them up this pass right before the blizzard hit." Inside the cabin, Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Elizabeth's face went white. "We didn't steal anything," she whispered to the empty room. "They're lying." Sam didn't turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the men, reading their posture, checking their hands. "Haven't seen any women," Sam lied, his voice flat and calm. "Storm like that, it would have killed anyone foolish enough to be traveling. If they're up here, they're buried under 10 feet of snow by now." The man beside Carlson, a young hothead with a scar on his chin, snarled, "He's lying. Look at the smoke. Look at the path. Maybe we should go inside and take a look for ourselves. Make sure he isn't hiding our thieves." Sam took a half step forward, shifting the rifle just enough so the sun glinted off the metal. "You cross onto my land," Sam warned, his voice dropping an octave, "and you won't leave it standing up." Carlson laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "You threatening officers of the law, McBride? That's a hanging offense. You're no law I recognize," Sam shot back. "You're a hired thug with a tin star. Come back when you have a warrant. Come back when you have proof." The young man didn't like that. He spurred his horse forward, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt. "I'm done talking." Crack. The sound of Sam's Winchester echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. Snow exploded inches from the young deputy's boot, sending his horse rearing back in panic. The man yelled, fighting to stay in the saddle as the animal danced sideways. "The next one won't be a warning," Sam said. He hadn't even raised the rifle to his shoulder. He'd fired from the hip with terrifying accuracy. Carlson's face darkened, his eyes narrowing into slits. He looked at Sam, then at the rifle, then at the defensible position of the cabin. He did the math. "You're making a mistake, McBride." Carlson spat. "A big one. Get off my mountain," Sam said. The men glared at him. egos bruised and anger simmering, but they turned their horses. They retreated slowly, disappearing back into the trees, leaving a trail of threats hanging in the cold air. Sam watched them until they were gone, waiting until the sound of hooves faded completely. Only then did he turn and go back inside. Elizabeth was standing in the middle of the room, shaking uncontrollably. Martha looked pale. "They'll come back," Martha whispered, her voice heavy with dread. Sam nodded, barring the door. "Yes, they will, and they'll bring more men next time." Elizabeth stepped toward him, looking small and terrified. "What do we do, Samuel?" Sam began to pace the small room, his mind racing through the geography of the peaks, calculating time and distance. "You can't go anywhere fast. The trails will be watched now. If you try to run for Denver, they'll hunt you down in the open. So we're trapped?" Elizabeth asked. "No," Sam said, stopping and looking at them with a fierce intensity. "We prepare." "For what?" Martha asked. "For a siege," Sam answered. "Or a war, asterisk." That night, the cabin ceased to be a home and transformed into an armory. The comfortable silence of the last few days was replaced by the sharp, metallic clicks of weapons being stripped and reassembled. Sam worked by the light of a single tallow candle, his hands moving with a grim efficiency that frightened Elizabeth. Though she tried hard not to show it, he checked the action on his Winchester, oiled the springs of his Colt, and sharpened his hunting knife until the edge could split a hair. The women didn't sit idle. The reality of their situation had stripped away their panic, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. Elizabeth boiled the last of the salted meat to pack for the journey, while Martha tore her petticoats into strips for bandages. They worked in a rhythm, a silent team preparing for the worst. "There's a cave system," Sam said quietly, breaking the silence as he packed a rucksack. "It's high up on the ridge, near the Devil's Backbone. It's hidden, and there's only one way up. If we can get there, we can hold them off." He looked at Martha's leg, his eyes filled with doubt. "It's a brutal climb, Martha. Steep and deep in snow." Martha met his gaze, her chin lifted. "I'll make it, Samuel. I won't be the reason we get caught." They left just before dawn, slipping out into a world of gray shadows and biting cold. The snow was waist deep in places, a heavy, wet blanket that fought them for every inch of progress. Sam took the lead, breaking the trail with his snowshoes, his breath pluming in the freezing air like steam from an engine. The women followed in his wake, stepping in his oversized tracks. To save their strength, the first few hours were a blur of physical agony. The air at this altitude was thin, burning their lungs with every gasp. Twice, Sam lost his footing on hidden ice, sliding back several yards before digging his boots in. Once, Elizabeth fell face first into a drift, crying out as her shin struck a buried rock. But before Sam could even turn around, she was pushing herself back up, wiping the snow from her face with a fierce determination he hadn't known she possessed. By midday, they reached a narrow ravine. It was the halfway point, but disaster was waiting for them. As they navigated a slick patch of shale, Martha's bad ankle gave way. She didn't scream, but the sharp intake of breath was loud enough to cut through the wind. She collapsed into the snow, her face turning ashen. Sam was at her side in a second. "Let me see." I can't," Martha whispered, tears of pain leaking from her eyes. "It won't hold my weight." "Then it doesn't have to," Sam said firmly. He crouched down, presenting his back. "Climb on." "Samuel, you can't." "Get on, Martha. We aren't discussing this." He hoisted the older woman onto his back, gritting his teeth as the extra weight settled onto his shoulders. Elizabeth silently grabbed the extra packs, slinging them over her own exhausted frame. They pushed on, but their pace had slowed to a crawl. Sam stopped suddenly, scanning the valley floor far below them. Against the pristine white snow, dark specks were moving. "They found the trail," Sam muttered, watching the riders navigate the lower slopes. "They're moving fast." Elizabeth squinted at the distant figures. "They'll catch us before we reach the caves, won't they?" Sam didn't answer immediately. He looked at the steep climb ahead, then back at the trackers. He knew the math. They were too slow. They needed a diversion. "Change of plans," Sam said, veering off the main path toward a Cluster of rocks. There's an old hunting camp about a quarter-mile east. It's barely a shelter, just a broken roof and a fire pit, but it's going to save us. How? Elizabeth asked, stumbling after him. We're going to make them think we've stopped. Sam explained. We make a show. We make noise when they reach the dilapidated lean-to. Sam went to work. He instructed Elizabeth to spread some of their supplies around a torn piece of cloth, a tin cup to make it look occupied. He gathered wet pine boughs and lit a fire, piling the greenwood high until a thick column of black smoke rose into the clear blue sky. It was a beacon, visible for miles. Make noise, Sam ordered. Shout, let the wind carry it. Martha yelled, her voice echoing off the canyon walls, down in the valley. The dark specks stopped moving. The riders had seen the smoke. They paused, grouping up, likely planning an ambush on the camp. They're taking the bait, Sam whispered, watching the pursuers slow their approach to be cautious. They think they have us cornered. That buys us an hour, maybe two. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, purple shadows across the mountain. The trap was set. Now, they just had to vanish before the jaws snapped shut. Let's go, Sam said, extinguishing the actual flames, but leaving the smoky wood to smolder. Quietly this time, no tracks if you can help it. They slipped away into the darkening tree line, leaving the decoy camp burning behind them, praying the ruse would hold long enough for them to reach the safety of the stone. Night had fully descended by the time they reached the cave entrance, transforming the mountain into a void of ink and shadow. Their lungs burned with the thin, freezing air, and every step was a battle against gravity. Just as they scrambled up the final jagged slope of loose shale, the darkness below them came alive. Torches flickered into existence at the tree line 1, then 3, then a dozen moving fast. The decoy had bought them time, but not enough. Hurry, Sam roared, shoving the women toward the black maw of the cavern. They stumbled inside, collapsing onto the cold stone floor. Sam didn't join them yet. He braced his shoulder against a massive, rounded boulder sitting near the entrance stone he had positioned years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. With a guttural growl that strained every tendon in his neck, he heaved. The rock groaned, tipped, and then rolled with a thunderous grinding sound, slamming into place across the opening. The world went pitch black. Outside, the muffled shouts of angry men echoed through the stone. A moment later, the heavy thud of pickaxes and rifle butts struck the boulder. They were trying to break in. They're going to get through, Elizabeth whispered in the dark, her voice trembling. We trapped ourselves. Not yet. Sam's voice came from the blackness, calm and steady. We've got time. A match flared to life, illuminating Sam's weathered face. He touched the flame to a tallow candle, and the flickering light revealed their surroundings. It wasn't just a hole in the rock. It was a cache. Shelves carved into the limestone held jars of water, dried venison, and heavy-wool blanket supplies. Sam had forgotten he'd stashed here half a lifetime ago. It felt like a miracle. Eat, Sam commanded, handing them strips of dried meat. Drink. We don't stop for long. He moved to the back of the cave, running his hand along a fissure in the wall that looked too small for a coyote, let alone a man. This isn't a dead end, he told them. It's a chimney vent. It leads to the south face of the ridge. It's going to be tight, and it's going to hurt, but it's the only way out. They entered the tunnel on their hands and knees. The rock pressed in on them from all sides, cold and suffocating. It was a nightmare of claustrophobia. For Martha, with her ruined ankle, it was torture. She dragged her leg behind her, biting her lip until it bled to keep from screaming. Every few feet, she would whimper, a small, broken sound that echoed in the tight space, but she never stopped moving. Elizabeth crawled behind her, pushing her heels, whispering words of encouragement that she barely believed herself. That it felt like hours. It might have been minutes. Time lost all meaning in the crushing dark. Finally, Sam, who was in the lead, stopped. Fresh air, he rasped. He squeezed through a final, narrow constriction and tumbled out into the snow. He reached back, pulling Martha through, then Elizabeth. They lay gasping on the snow, the stars overhead looking brighter and colder than ever before. They were out. They were free. Crack! A bullet whizzed past Sam's ear, shattering a rock behind him. "Down!" Sam shouted, tackling the women into the snow. Gunfire erupted from the tree line below. Snow exploded around them in violent puffs. They found the exit. Sam yelled over the roar of the rifles. They predicted the tunnel. "Run!" He scooped Martha into his arms again, adrenaline overriding his exhaustion. Elizabeth grabbed his coat, slipping and sliding as they scrambled downhill, desperate for the cover of the dense pines. But the shots were getting closer. They were pinned down, exposed, with nowhere left to run. Then a new sound rolled across the mountain, a deep, booming report that sounded like a cannon compared to the sharp crack of the deputies' repeaters. "What in blazes is happening on my mountain?" a voice bellowed, shaking the snow from the branches. Out of the shadows stepped a giant of a man, clad in furs, holding a long-range Sharps buffalo rifle. It was Josiah Wells, Sam's oldest friend and the only other man who truly knew these peaks, and he wasn't alone. 3 other hunters flanked him, their rifles raised and steady, aimed squarely at the men chasing Sam. "Josiah!" Sam shouted, relief nearly bringing him to his knees. The tide turned in an instant. The deputies, realizing they were now outgunned and facing men who hunted grizzlies for sport, stopped firing. Josiah racked the lever of his rifle, staring down the scope at the corrupt lawmen. "You boys are a long way from home," he called out, his voice dangerous. "I suggest you turn around before the wolves get a free meal." Sam lowered Martha gently to the snow, his chest heaving. He looked at Josiah, then at the women. They were safe, finally. They were safe, *you intact, Sam? Josiah asked, stepping through the deep drifts, his face crinkling into a grin beneath a bushy gray beard. Sam nodded, the adrenaline finally draining out of his system, leaving his knees feeling like water. "I am now." They made camp that night in Josiah's cabin, a structure twice the size of Sam's and filled with the trophies of a lifetime of hunting. For the first time in a week, they slept without one eye open. Josiah knew frontier medicine, as well as he knew tracking. He bound Martha's ankle with a practiced hand and fed them thick elk stew that tasted like salvation. "You did right, protecting them," Josiah said quietly to Sam later, as the women slept safely by the hearth. "Those men were rotten. They'll answer for what they tried to do." Josiah was a man of his word. He sent a fast rider to Denver before dawn. 3 days later, a federal marshal arrived in the valley. He wasn't like Carlson. This man was iron-spined and honest. It turned out Carlson had been running a corruption racket in Silver Creek for years, and the accusations against Elizabeth and Martha were nothing but smoke to cover his own crimes. Carlson was arrested, stripped of his crooked badge, and hauled away in chains. The charges against the women evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Suddenly, they were free. They could go anywhere. They could leave the mountains and head for the city like they planned. But as they stood outside Josiah's cabin, packing their few belongings to leave, Sam felt a hollow ache in his chest. He thought of his own cabin, safe again, silent again, empty again, and he realized something he had been fighting since that very first knock on his door. He didn't want the silence back. He didn't want them to leave. He walked up to Elizabeth. She was securing a pack to a horse, her movements slow, her eyes downcast and sad. "Don't go," Sam said. It was the bravest thing he'd ever said, scarier than facing down a wolf or a gunman. Elizabeth froze. She turned to him, hope flaring in her sage green eyes. "Are you sure, Samuel? We have nothing to offer you but trouble." "You have everything I need," he answered simply. 3 nights later, in the parlor of the only hotel in the nearest settlement, Samuel McBride stood uncomfortably in a stiff collar and a clean shirt, holding his head in hands that were shaking. Just a little. Elizabeth walked toward him, not in a silk gown, but in a simple dress that Martha had mended and cleaned. She looked more beautiful to him than any sunrise he'd ever watched over the peaks. The marshal, who happened to be an ordained minister, spoke the words. "I do," Sam said, his voice deep and sure. "I do," Elizabeth whispered. Martha sat in the front row, crying harder than she had during the blizzard, but these were tears of pure joy. When Sam kissed his new wife, the crushing loneliness of 12 long, hard winters didn't just melt. It vanished, replaced by a warmth that no fire could ever match. They returned to the mountain, but not to the same life. They spent the next few months expanding the cabin, adding rooms, and letting the light in. It became more than just a shelter. It became a home, over time. It even became a refuge, a place where lost travelers and broken souls could find the same mercy Sam had shown to strangers in a storm. It was the perfect ending to a true Western love story. And sometimes, when the chores were done and the sun was dipping below the granite ridges, setting the snow on fire with gold and violet light, Elizabeth would stand on the porch beside him. She would take his rough, scarred hand in hers, look up at him with a teasing smile, and repeat the words he had spoken that first gruff night. "I never had a wife," she would whisper, and Sam would squeeze her hand, looking at the woman who had saved him just as much as he had saved her. "Now you do," he would answer, and he meant it with every beat of his heart.